we'll be talking about, how to break the current stalemate. Okay, and I believe that Dr. Hecker will be talking about technical aspect of how to make the, break the stalemate, and Bob will be talking more political and diplomatic ways of, breaking the stalemate, and Peter will be talking about much more technical and particularly energy perspective and incentive perspective, which they're saying, no, this would be much more, open discussions. Therefore, I would ask, Sig and Bob and Peter give us just 5 to 6 minute, brief, presentation, and then we'll have open discussions. Okay, Vala.
Very good. Thank you, Chung In. So in my 5 to 6 minutes, I'll try to do this as quickly as possible. So since you said we're at a stalemate, we're trying to break the stalemate. So what I thought I could do is to try to explain where are we at this stalemate. And in other words, it's important to understand what is the nuclear situation as we're in this stalemate. So let me give you my quick technical assessment of where I think we are. So first of all, I think that North Korea has sufficient fissile materials, that's the bomb fuel, plutonium and highly enriched uranium, for perhaps as many as 30 to 40 bombs. It has done 6 nuclear tests. 5 of them have been successful. And the last one in September of 2017, was large enough that it was probably what we call a thermonuclear or a hydrogen bomb. So in other words, they have the capability to build the size of bombs that destroyed Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and they have one that's about 10 times as powerful. With the flurry of missile tests that they did in 2015, 16, and 17, and with those nuclear tests combined, we believe that they have now the military capability to mount nuclear warheads, nuclear bombs, on the Scuds and Nodong missiles. And that would be sufficient to reach all of South Korea and most of Japan. I do not think they yet have demonstrated that they have a militarily useful ICBM, intercontinental range missile, nor do they have a warhead small enough, light enough, robust enough to be able to survive. So in other words, I do not think they can reach the US as yet. However, judging on the basis of my visits to North Korea over the years, studying North Korea over the years, and knowing something about the nuclear business, I think given enough time, the North Koreans can get there. So what are they doing during this time of stalemate, essentially 2018 and 2019? Well, they have indeed stopped nuclear testing, and they have stopped long-range missile tests. They've, let me just say, deactivated the nuclear test site. They destroyed the tunnels. However, they're still making fissile materials, particularly highly enriched uranium, and at least up to last year, they were still making some plutonium. We're quite confident they have not made any plutonium this year in 2019, but it's not for diplomatic or political reasons. It's for technical reasons. They're redoing the entire cooling system for those reactors, and they've given indications they're ready to restart the 5 megawatt, as it's called, the plutonium production reactor, and they may be ready to start this experimental light water reactor that they showed Bob and myself in early construction in 2010. And because of the capacity that they have, they can add 5 to 6 or 7 bombs worth of these fissile materials per year. So in other words, they could increase the size of the arsenal. And all indications are that they continue to operate those facilities. And even though they did no missile tests at all for nearly 18 months, they now have had a flurry of missile tests from May until the end of November. And those missile tests are short-range ballistic missiles and then what are called multiple rocket launchers. What's important about those is they apparently use solid rocket motors. That's extremely important because those are much faster to bring out, easier to hide. So they have plenty of nuclear capability where they sit right now in this stalemate. However, we should remember that if they've promised this new way, it could still get worse. In other words, they could get to the point where they develop the long-range ICBMs, where they're able to develop a small enough warhead to put on an ICBM, where they could threaten the continental US, not just Japan, South Korea, and US assets, but also that. Even more worrisome to me would be if they really decide to go all out and do much more with tactical nuclear weapons, such as battlefield nuclear weapons. That would be a great concern. So if they go back to nuclear testing, to long-range missile testing, that would be indeed a big concern. And if they do that, and we can talk more about this later, then I would see that it moves North Korea in a very bad direction with the United States. That in 2017, when President Trump came in, he was told by President Obama at the end of Obama's term that North Korea is the biggest security concern for the United States. It's the biggest threat. But then, because of the actions of 2018, all of a sudden, for President Trump, North Korea becomes the biggest opportunity from an international relations. And now, if they go back to any of these things, restart their reactors, do the missile tests, do more nuclear tests, then they again become the biggest threat. And when they become the biggest threat, then I'm afraid we're back to the days of 2017 and the potential of nuclear use, not intentional, in my opinion, but through miscalculation, misunderstanding, and misperceptions. So in terms of how does one break this stalemate, Bob and I actually, just before the Singapore summit, we put out a comprehensive history of North Korean nuclear program and a comprehensive plan as to what should be done. And we called it HALT, Roll Back, and Eliminate. And that process we thought would take probably up to 10 years' time, because you're going to have to to convince the North Koreans we're actually serious, we don't have hostile policy, we don't threaten the North Koreans, and they may eventually be willing to eliminate those. So how do you do that? We proposed one takes phased reciprocal steps. That is, the North Koreans actually take steps to do the rollback, and the US responds with reciprocal steps in terms of addressing North Korea's security and also its economic development. And then one idea that we've proposed that's sort of the most radical to get you back, to break the stalemate, is to actually say, rather than insisting on complete denuclearization of all of North Korea's nuclear programs and facilities, we actually propose to the North Koreans we work with them on converting the nuclear and missile program, military, to civilian nuclear and civilian space program. And in that process, you wind up having people there on the ground working jointly with the North Koreans and actually be able to convince them that you don't have these hostile intent. In addition, what it also does, it provides a significant potential avenue as to what to do with all of those people in the North Korea nuclear program and in the North Korea missile program. So it would be similar to what the US did with the Soviet Union, and that is doing its dissolution, and then with Russia, is sort of a cooperative threat reduction, or in this case, what I would call cooperative conversion. So, in my opinion, those things are all possible to break the stalemate. However, and in this way I can introduce Bob, is the North Koreans have to answer the phone. And that is, the U.S. actually has put a lot on the table. And they seem to be not willing to answer the phone at this point. Thank you.
Thank you. Bob?
Breaking the, I don't know if this thing is breaking the stalemate. Is it on? Use this. Thanks. Okay. Now. Didn't press anything. Okay. Breaking the stalemate. To break the stalemate, I think we're going to have to temporarily suspend our thinking about long-term solutions and long-term plans, and we have to focus our efforts on one or two actions that will actually restore the atmosphere for the two sides to sit down and start to examine more seriously what they have to do and in what order. For that reason, I think there might be three questions to ask. First of all, why are the North Koreans continuing to build up? Why can't they, in their own minds, come to the conclusion that they have enough, they don't need any more, and they can take SIG's first step and just stop? So far, they don't give any indication that they're prepared to stop. And I honestly don't understand why not. If they do have 40 nuclear weapons, why does a country the size of North Korea need 80 or 100 or 120? So that's a worrisome thing that we have to keep in mind. If we are going to proceed with the negotiations, though, one of the first steps I think they're going to have to take, and they aren't going to like it, and it's going to be very difficult, they have to freeze production of fissile material. The reason is it's very difficult for the United States to carry on negotiations with a gun at its head. In 1994, we got them to stop, freeze their facilities at Yongbyon, and that allowed us to proceed with the agreed framework negotiations. It's much more difficult this time because they have many more facilities off Yongbyon, and they don't seem prepared at the moment to allow inspections. There's got to be verification. So that's a big hurdle. We have to get past that. What steps could we take, really, in terms of shock therapy to get things started? I would ask the question, what would happen if the United States were simply to say, all right, we're going to recognize the DPRK. We're going to establish embassies, and as soon as possible, we'll have an ambassador in place. Big question is, what would the ROK response be if the United States were to recognize the DPRK as a sovereign state? Would it cause big problems? Or is it something that you'd be able to live with? Don't forget, this would be a step going back to Henry Kissinger's cross-recognition. China and the USSR were to recognize the ROK, which they did, and the US and Japan were to recognize the DPRK, which they haven't done. Would this satisfy the DPRK, at least initially, as a signal that the US was rolling back its hostile policy? It's a question. I think it would be an effective step, but finally, what could we do on sanctions? I have thought, first of all, we're not going to be able to do much on US sanctions early in this process. So any progress will have to be on the UN Security Council sanctions. I think that the North Koreans would look seriously at an effort by the US to accommodate, but not completely buy into, their initial proposal for lifting those sanctions put in place since 2016, I think it is. How could we do that? Well, there's language in the Security Council resolutions which actually provide us a doorway. First of all, the resolutions expressly say that these sanctions are not intended to harm the well-being of the North Korean people. I'm pretty sure the Chinese and probably the Russians pushed for that language to be put in there, and the Americans just shrugged and said, oh, fine, go ahead, we don't care. But now it could be something that we could use beneficially. Secondly, if the North Koreans do anything in the towards denuclearization, it gives the Security Council a chance to go back to its resolutions because each of them says if there's a change in the situation, the Security Council will review. Now, what that meant was if they do something bad, we can go back and tighten sanctions, but it works the other way as well. How could we do that? I think we could divide the sanctions into 3 baskets. The first basket is what I would call the red basket. That is those elements in the sanctions resolutions that we say, nah, they're too difficult and too contentious, and we'll have to wait for later. So we put those in the red basket, we put them aside. Second basket is the green basket. What is that? It is those parts of the sanctions which clearly affect the well-being of the North Korean people, or you can make the argument, and don't really have much of an impact on the North Korean nuclear weapons program. They may provide some funding, but it's probably not very much. And these were more symbolic than they were really substantive. So we can separate out, or we can try to separate out some that we could move on immediately. And then you have what I call the blue baskets. That is everything that's left over that we're not sure about, and we need to talk more to the North Koreans and to our UN partners to see if there's something we can do on those. Normally, the North Koreans would not hold firm to it's all or nothing. You've got to lift all those sanctions or we're not moving. Under normal circumstances, their foreign ministry would bargain on this stuff, and it would be enough to get us started. Question is that their mode of operation these days? And as Sig said, it doesn't seem to be, but we need to test it, and we need to test it in the next 26 days, I think, before the 31st of December.
Peter?
So how to break the stalemate which emerged in Hanoi? I think it's fairly clear that the two sides are deadlocked on the nuclear side of a deal, which suggests that only a small deal at this point is feasible, but still very, very important because it's a precondition of moving forward. It's a necessary but not sufficient condition of breaking the stalemate. And at the same time, whatever form that deal takes with respect to Yongbyon or beyond, one would require a reaffirmation of the denuclearization commitment by both sides, because both sides have responsibilities with respect to removal of nuclear threat in the Korean Peninsula. On the other side of the stalemate, the peacemaking side, it is possible, as Bob just suggested, to make progress very quickly. One could normalize relations almost overnight. One could adjust US forces Korea in certain respects to make it even more of a tripwire function than it is at the moment, possibly by adjusting ground forces to some degree. And one would probably expect there to be some form of a peace agreement that would expand military-to-military contact, possibly involve the trilateral role of UN Command beyond the current roles that UN Command has in its jurisdictions, and start or expand conventional arms control talks in the inter-Korean relationship, reminding ourselves that the military-to-military agreement from Panmunjom has provided the space and the time for all the symmetry that's gone on. That's a fundamental achievement of South Korea. And as part of this peace breakthrough that would match the small nuclear deal, one would set in motion the full-scale economic engagement dialogue with North Korea in a framework yet to be defined, as far as I know. That is a natural segue or lead into the energy component of a breakthrough. As you all know, energy sanctions are the essence, in some respects, not the only sanctions, but the essence of sanctions that have been imposed by the Security Council. But we also know that North Korea planned ahead for this. They installed a catalytic converter on the refinery that increased the refined product output from the crude oil imported from China in 2016, 2017. In advance of the sanctions, they imported a coal to gasification converter unit now installed at Hamhung that produces about 10% of their refined product requirements of oil from coal. They've, of course, decreased by dictate the demand in various end-use sectors, particularly in the market economy. And they've done a gap-filling exercise by converting biomass into transport fuels at the cost to their forests with gasifiers on the back of trucks and vehicles. They've increased coal use in ways that have offset some of the electricity requirements in fact, that's made it easier because of the coal export sanctions. There's more coal available in North Korea. And they've filled the gap with smuggling. And in our quantitative analysis, which we've just updated, we show that the North Koreans have essentially sustained their energy, available energy end-use activity from 2016 up to 2017 without major scarcity. And this supply-demand balance, in our view, can be sustained indefinitely, provided China provides the 500,000 tons of crude oil each year. That means that energy sanctions have reached their maximum effect already. It's not going to be possible, in our view, to tighten that noose around North Korea's neck. If we were in a negotiating strategy with partial sanctions relief, our advice to the United States and to South Korea and to China would be as follows. First is you would allow partial re-export of coal to China in order to pay for the imports from China, particularly of food and other critical goods that are essential for livelihood of the North Korean population. You would introduce a package of sanctions relief designed to introduce microgrids, small-scale renewable wind power, supplemented by local hydropower and diesel generators that are isolated microgrids aimed at either welfare-generating public centers such as hospitals, clinics, schools, so a humanitarian application of microgrids, combined with a potent set of microgrids which you could call megawatts for mines, specifically to allow the gold, the zinc, and other valuable mines to operate, which are currently severely hampered by the lack of reliable power or any power at all. And this would be immensely valuable to the mining sector in North Korea. I'm not suggesting all the mines be provided with megawatts of microgrid, but some could be very quickly. And the advantage of these two elements is that within 6 months, you could install these microgrids. From time zero, 6 months out, you could deliver actual tangible benefits. And in the first phase of any breakthrough deal between North Korea and the United States and South Korea, trust building is absolutely critical. It's therefore important you not just have one big project that will take forever, possibly never get completed. You have many small, very fast projects underway. Out of 10 projects, 5 will fail, 3 will be blocked, 2 will work, maybe only 1. But in political and trust building terms, you have 1 left standing, working at the end of the day to show that in extremely difficult conditions, it is possible to do business with North Korea. That's the rapid, immediate response. Accompanying that, of course, would be a strategic dialogue involving all the countries of the region as to what you would do to reconstruct North Korea's energy system in a way that benefits all the countries in the region, not just North Korea. This is a fundamentally different approach to the six-party talks energy dialogue, where we would put forward options, the North Koreans would make demands, there was almost no overlap, and we would just pay them an energy bribe, in effect, for good behavior, and then things would go bad. We need a strategic approach that is regional in nature, benefits North Korea, but also benefits South Korea, Russia, Japan, Mongolia, and China. That should be the fundamental framework. That is a dialogue that we have never had with North Korea and could start based on these very rapid breakthrough projects. In 1991, when I first went to Pyongyang, Kim Jong-un used a metaphor in explaining the North Korean nuclear weapons strategy, which at that point he was in charge of. He said that the strategy is the barrier that makes the water flow. And I think at the moment we have a real logjam, and we need to find a couple of logs in that logjam and pull on them really hard, and then things will start to change. But anything short of that, we will be log-jammed, and it won't be pretty.
Okay, without further ado, I'll just open to the floor. Santek, we want to start first? Yes. Okay, I'll give you the great honor. To you.
Thank you so much. I am Santek Wang of YTN. It's a cable TV news channel in Korea. I was just sitting in the middle of the chairs, so that's what I was speaking. Yes, one thing I would like to raise or give my opinion or a question is that we need to try to find out why Hanoi summit was failed. That's kind of first step to understand what's gonna be happen. What should we, how can we get the next step way? And in the morning session, actually, I could not get those kind of discussions. So I would like to ask your senior, my kind of mentor people, what do you think, what caused the Hanoi deal fail? Who should be responsible for the failures? Is it Trump, or is it policy, wrong strategy of Kim Jong Un, or there is some misstep by South Korean facilitating role or mediating role? I would like to hear those things.
Okay, I think you have an answer, but you have an answer. Both of you heard from Steve Biegun, American side story. And I will tell the North Korean side story. And Peter, if you have any additional information, you can also join us.
Well, I don't look at it as the American side story. I look at it as someone who's been engaged in the diplomacy, and it's a process failure. It's like a plane crash. It's not one single thing which caused the plane crash. It's a series. It's a cascade of problems. The first one being the working level talks were not sufficiently anchored. They weren't, I'll be interested in the North Korean version, because the US version is they couldn't get the North Koreans really to engage very much on the key questions. They kept kicking it upstairs. Well, we always worried about that as a problem. because there's only so much negotiating that can go on at the top level. And so a lot more needed to be done there at the working level. Second problem was apparently Kim Jong Un was not prepared to budge on their demands. It would have been normal for them to start with at a high level with a maximum demand and then slowly back away from it. And that didn't happen. Finally, the question of what defines Yongbyon. How big is it? What's involved in it? They would not answer that question until it was too late. For some reason, they were holding back, and the Americans needed an answer to that for some reason. Didn't get it until things were already starting to breakup is a wrong term. It was not a hard breakup. It was not someone pushing back their chair and saying, well, that's the end of it. President Trump deliberately wanted to make sure that it was not a hard breakup. But as far as we can tell, and a lot of people have this impression, Kim Jong Un felt insulted. And that has affected his policies from March onward in what he was going to do with President Trump. So there was misunderstanding, there was misperceptions, there was misplanning. That doesn't let the Americans off the hook, but I think both sides made a series of mistakes.
So you want me to add to Bob's? Yeah, I think if I would have to summarize it, I would say, when you said, look, who's at fault, I would say, yes, both sides, for reasons that Bob just said. On the American side, I think one of the problems is they went into Hanoi with a house divided. Different people with very different opinions. You know, for example, of course, there was Trump who wanted to make a deal. There was Steve Biegun who certainly was interested in the deal. And there was John Bolton who was not interested in a deal and had his different vision of what should come out of Hanoi. And so that house divided then does not let you get to a point where it's easy to make a final decision. So that's what I see as a problem on the American side. On the North Korean side, as Bob said, you know, by far the biggest problem that I see is their negotiating team just did not engage, particularly on the denuclearization side beforehand. And those things had to be done to prepare the different possibilities of what would come out of Hanoi, and that was not done beforehand. And then when the final questions came up as to what the North Koreans were going to offer up, as Bob had just indicated, to offer up Yongbyon, and by offering up, and the Americans asked, so what is Yongbyon? You know, because in the past when they discussed it, well, you know, they're talking about a reactor and talking about a reprocessing facility, those facilities that make plutonium. Not necessarily discussion about the uranium enrichment centrifuge facility. And of course, Yongbyon is a huge site, you know, with 300 some buildings. It is the majority of North Korea's ability to make the nuclear fissile materials and the hydrogen isotopes for a hydrogen bomb. So it's a big deal. But by the time they finally came with the answer that Yongbyon means everything, and that's what the public heard, because in the midnight news conference by the foreign minister and the deputy foreign minister, they said, Yongbyon, we're willing to give up Yongbyon, and it meant everything. But they didn't come with that answer until it was too late. Literally, President Trump was walking out of the room as they came with that answer. And so they were too late. So to me, I view those things as being tactical mistakes that were made on both sides. Strategically, they had the right idea, build on Singapore Summit. And that strategy is still the right strategy. Tactically, they made big mistakes on both sides. And then, as Bob had indicated, Kim Jong Un not only felt insulted, but I think humiliated.
No, but then, now, after Hanoi, the United States knew what is meant by Yongbyon deal. It's a big deal. And they also know that what North Korea wants, partial relaxation of sanctions since 2016. And as they relate to the civilian economy in North Korea and people's livelihood, now the United States knew what is the nature of North Korean proposal. And when they met in Stockholm, why couldn't American delegations start with the Yongbyon deal? Apparently it was not. Because Yongbyon offer was kind of dismissed by the United States. Why is that? Afterwards, Dr. Heck, you talked about how wonderful Yongbyon deal could be. Bob, you have been saying that one too. Now, United States, even President Trump should know what is the nature of a Yongbyon deal. But still, U.S. was not paying attention to Yongbyon. And also, I don't know whether it's true or not, according to Yomiuri Shimbun, what U.S. wanted was really transfer, the North Korean commitment to transfer of all the nuclear weapons and missiles to the United States, North Korean commitment to dismantle nuclear, biochemical, and missiles. Okay? And then afterwards they talked about Yongbyon. Therefore I couldn't understand why, if Yongbyon deal was so good, okay? Of course, at the time, on February 28th, Trump missed that opportunity to get the full explanation about Yongbyon. But later, if they had known the nature of the Yongbyon deal, why couldn't the US have approached North Korea as such? One of the answers.
We don't work for the government or the Trump administration, so I can't speak for the administration. But let me tell you my own sense, and this is certainly what I've advised our government, is that Yongbyon is a big deal. So what we had proposed before in this halt, roll back, and eliminate is you do that on the basis of taking steps that reduce the risks that North Korean nuclear program poses, to the rest of us. And so I laid out the most important steps for them to take were actually first, no nuclear tests, and then no long-range missile tests. And then, as Bob had already indicated, no more fissile materials production. Well, it turns out the North Koreans did take the first two steps, no long-range missile and no nuclear test. The reason those are important, because as I had indicated before, if you want more bombs, you make more fissile materials. If you want more sophisticated bombs that you're able to put into ICBMs, or even smaller bombs to put into the shorter range rockets yet, you need the nuclear tests. And you need plutonium. And if you want hydrogen bombs, you need tritium. It turns out plutonium and tritium are made only in Yongbyon. And if they shut down Yongbyon, they shut down the plutonium. Now, it doesn't mean they can still make they cannot make highly enriched uranium. When I visited in 2010 with Bob, and they showed us the centrifuge facility, when I saw that and I realized the time scale in which they built that, I immediately said, they have another centrifuge facility someplace, because you can't just put that up in 1 year and have it work. So we said all along, they have another centrifuge facility. But quite frankly, if you shut down Yongbyon, you don't shut down all of the highly enriched uranium, but making a few more highly enriched uranium kilograms is nowhere near as important as not making plutonium, not doing the long-range missile test, not doing the nuclear test. So in North Korea's defense, they actually took some significant steps. They were willing now to take the big step, but they were too late. And then, as Bob had indicated, they stopped talking. And so one was never able to get back to have the conversation that you indicated.
Let's look at that real quickly. Let's look at the actual way this unfolded. Kim declared the end of testing nuclear and long-range missiles well before the Singapore summit. And he did it as part of a major internal shift in policy toward what they said was everything for the economy. In their minds, apparently, they deserve to be sort of compensated by the United States for that step. It didn't occur to the Americans, I'm telling you, that this was actually part of the dialogue because there was no dialogue yet. And as the dialogue proceeded, it's as if the North Koreans were waiting for the Americans to take their step. I'm convinced Washington did not understand it was their turn. And it wasn't until later that the North Koreans started to make clear, no, we're not going to take another step until you come up to what we did already. Well, that may not seem like a difficult thing for Washington to understand and then act on, but it was. And partially it was because the North Koreans didn't make it clear. They didn't think they needed to make it clear, but they did.
Okay, any other follow-up questions? Don't monopolize it. Make a quick question, okay?
Yes, thank you. Dr. Hecker said the Yongbyon offer is big deal, but we remember that a lot of voices in Washington and also some of Seoul regarded Yongbyon deal, Yongbyon offer, as a small deal. And the small deal is bad deal. That kind of understanding, that kind of approach actually killed the offer. So that the small deal or Yongbyon offers a small deal approach actually coming out even before the 2019. It is after the South Korea summit in September because the Yongbyon deal is part of the agreement between the two presidents. So it is discussed a lot, long way. So I think that's kind of made some fatigue in the Washington, D.C. people. And that is one of the bad choice, bad strategy coming up ahead of the big summit. So how do you think about this?
Yeah, of course, I'm quite aware of the fact that different people have different opinions. Let me just say, from a technical standpoint, as much as I know of the North Korean nuclear complex, and of course, I've been there, I've had a chance to go through there, and I just explained to you what they're able to do and not do, like not making plutonium, not making tritium. That is a big deal. Plutonium is that much more important than is highly enriched uranium for nuclear weapons. Much more important. There are a lot of people who don't understand that. People who, in addition to that, the problem that you have in Washington, it's generally believed in the political circles. Look, North Korea has given up Yongbyon before. They did so during the agreed framework. And the Americans bought that deal. And now they're going to go back and buy the same horse again. That's the political argument. The problem is, Yongbyon is so much different today than it is before. The other argument that you get, that people say, well, Yongbyon is old. It's falling apart. They can't operate it anymore. Let me tell you, that's simply not true. When they say the reactor is old, 1986 it was started, the plutonium production reactor. That's newer than any of the plutonium facilities in the United States, including at Los Alamos. I know that because I was there. So don't tell me they can't operate that reactor. I've had discussions with the director at Yongbyon about that reactor, and I said, just to sort of say, look, that thing is old. You'll never get it restarted. And he just smiled and he said, yeah, that's what you said in 2002, and we got it restarted. They did it again, in 2013, and now they're going to do it again. And so that place, it's not old, it's not dilapidated, it's not a small part, but it doesn't, shutting down Yongbyon doesn't get rid of a single weapon at this point. The reason we think it's a big deal, we laid out a step-by-step comprehensive program to say this is an important first step. along with no nuclear testing, no missile testing, no Yongbyon, that is a big, big first step. And it does require some reciprocal action. But then again, Hanoi was a tactical mistake by both sides.
And I think, as Bob said, ignorance and stubbornness of Washington pundit and bureaucrats should be blamed for. I will take one, okay, Yong-Su Huang.
Yes, I appreciate your comments in this afternoon. I totally agree with you, Sig, as I already told you. Especially when you combine your idea about managing all the military facility to convert the military facility to civilian facility, along with the comprehensive CTR for the nuclear scientists. And if we add another thing, Yongbyon decombination, then it will become a very attractive package, total solution package for the United States and North Korea, I believe. Because as you already pointed out, Yongbyon is very important. And also, to manage the information and technology in human mind is also important for the global nuclear non-proliferation. And also North Korea would like to concern about how they can manage all the key scientists if we agree the peace agreement. So how can you propose this comprehensive package by combining Yongbyon decommissioning with human resource management and also the energy solution that Peter is talking about? We can convert many military nuclear scientists to civilian electricity supplier scientists by introducing firstly microgrid generation, then move to the nationwide energy grid generation with a lot of different energy options. Then we can probably persuade all the people in DPRK and some people in Washington, D.C., who has a higher value for the global non-proliferation, because this package can also accommodate how to manage the people and the information in North Korea.
If I just may respond quickly. We've had that discussion before, and as you know, I very much agree with you. And so that part of converting the people that are associated with the nuclear and the missile complex is really important. And as you also know, I have much of that experience in the Soviet Union to Russia transition, and I worked the same issue with the Russians. And the single most important thing, if you want to know what to do with their nuclear and missile people, you go ask them. You go ask them, because they know the people they have. They know the overall situation. We did that with the Russians, and they told us what was necessary. This is what one needs to do in North Korea. And most certainly, in terms of energy, I would turn him in the direction of sending Peter Hayes back up there, because he's got the right ideas as to what to do with their whole energy system. You do that with an energy system, particularly if you would allow civilian nuclear energy and civilian space. And then eventually they got to clean up the Yongbyon complex. You know, it's going to take an enormous effort to clean the complex up. So there are plenty of jobs. There are plenty of things to do. There are ways they could help energy, they could help the economy. But it has to be done with them, not to them.
Well, I will take, you want Peter? Young-Chun, you want to raise a question? Yes.
I just want to, if I may, I just want to supplement what Sig was saying about cooperative threat reduction, cooperative program on the nuclear science and technology side for employment. I agree with all that, and it's going to be a big job to clean up the legacy of the radioactive and toxic wastes at Yongbyon and other sites. But in the longer run, I don't think that's going to pay for itself, and we need to identify ways to retrain and redeploy most of those people. Of course, the nuclear weapons themselves need to be dismantled, but you can't dismantle the human beings who know how to make them. And they need to be gainfully and well employed in North Korea or elsewhere. And the only way to do that, in my view, is to expand how we think about CTR to be CTR plus. and the plus is the rest of the energy sector opportunities in North Korea. And in that regard, energy efficiency at end use, especially in buildings, is the most important component, not additional supply. Microgrid should be the starting point for reconstructing their power system, but that only makes sense if it's matched by a huge investment in reducing the waste of electricity in the buildings where most people live and die in North Korea. And that's also the fastest way to increase human welfare in the energy dimension.
Yes.
Thank you very much. My name is Byung-Chul Lee from Gyeongnam University. Well, I am still believing that the Yongbyon is still very effective in resolving North Korean nuclear issues because, as Dr. Hecker and Carlin pointed out, that Yongbyon is still. I think that Yongbyon is like heartland of North Korean nuclear issues. So some people in Washington argued that Yongbyon, they cannot buy the same horse twice or more. So I like to ask Bob or Dr. Hecker that, do you believe that Yongbyon is the same horse in the long ago? I believe that Yongbyon has become bigger and bigger than before. So I think that it's very still effective in resolving North Korean nuclear issue. So I'd like to hear your answer.
No, it's not the same horse. That horse has had offsprings, and they're all over Yongbyon. We've been tracking the Yongbyon facilities, from overhead. And there's so many new buildings. And even the old ones, like the reactor, they've done this enormous amount of work to totally reconfigure the river in order to make sure they have the cooling system. They're not ready to just get rid of that. They have a new centrifuge plant. That's a modern centrifuge plant. They've doubled that size. They're building what are called hot cells for tritium extractions. They have all of these facilities there. They've added facilities. You watch and you see those buildings going up over the years. It's not the same horse. However, you try to explain that to political people, it's very difficult to get across. And so that's where the phrase Yongbyon plus alpha or something else has come. And so from that standpoint, as Bob had said, and I've also said, if the North Koreans would sit down and talk to the Americans, you can talk about that. And you can actually say, look, why don't you give us a plus? For example, what I would say, why don't you cut up a couple of missiles? If you're not going to test ICBMs and they're not militarily useful, cut up a few missiles. And then you have Yongbyon plus something. So one has to do the right thing for both technical reasons and then for political reasons. And you have to weigh political benefits to the United States versus what North Korea thinks they actually lose by doing so. But as I've said already several times, you have to sit down and discuss that in order to make progress.
I think that we can continue this discussion last and final wrap-up session. But the current stalemate is very, very, awful, because the United States used to come up with the idea of you dismantle first, then we'll reward you. Therefore, dismantling was a kind of precondition. And now North Korea is saying that you withdraw, your hostile policy in North Korea completely and irreversibly, and then I will come to the negotiation table. Now both U.S. and North Korea are putting up preconditions for the resumption of negotiation. That's not good approach. And I hope that, as Bob said, both sides should come back to the working level talk without any preconditions. And then both sides should be much more open to the wide range of issues and agenda. And I would want to add one more point. If you want to really break the stalemate, they got to make even small successes. The problem is they're only rhetorics, no success stories. Therefore, what we need is the success stories. Thank you very much.